Welcome to Drinking on the Edge. I'm its host, David Fuhrer, and this is a remote version of our normal episodes. However, our founder and my producer, Matty Rosenberg, is at the Rhinecliff studio, and joining us from much farther away than from where Matty and I are today is Andrew Caillard, who is tuning in from Sydney, Australia. Welcome, Andrew.
Hello, good morning and good evening to you.
So, a little bit of background for those who may not be familiar with his work, which has been extensive and long-ranging. He's not the first master of wine to grace Drinking on the Edge, nor is he the first Australian. However, he is the first Australian master of wine. So, with 18 years of research culminating in what's a just published 3-volume tome of quite impressive detail, Andrew has penned the history of Australian wine from its 18th century inception to the present day, known as the Australian Ark, the story of Australian wine, just published. And I'm very proud to say that we are the first U.S. media outlet to carry him at some length. This is the ultimate reference book for the vines and wines of Andrew's adopted land. He was born and educated in the UK, a former residence of mine, with his family ties running quite deep in Australia. His mother's ancestors included the Rennells, Reynells. It's a family thought to have established the first vineyard and winery in South Australia. As a young man, Andrew took a wine marketing course at the University of Adelaide and became friends there with contemporaries such as Vanya Cullen and Sue Hodder, at the start of what was a period of which Australia's worldwide recognition as a new world force to be reckoned with for wine was coming about. But soon after leaving Adelaide's Roseworthy College, he worked as an auctioneer at a place called Langton's, probably not known to many fellow Americans, but certainly well known in Australia, where he developed its renowned classification of Australian wine some years back. And its importance as a collector's reference tool continues to this very day. And previous to today's subject of the Australian Ark, available through Academy Duvan Library, he's written 3 books about wine and produced 2 award-winning films, of which I've had the pleasure of viewing. Red Obsession, which is a story of how China fell in love with Bordeaux, which premiered in 2011 in Hong Kong at a conference I was hosting. I remember Deborah Meiber was there, a fellow master of wine, and she was featured in the film, and she was touting the film there in Hong Kong. And also, more presently, you were partly responsible for the 2021 production Blind Ambition. It's a story of 4 Zimbabwean sommeliers competing for the first wine tasting Olympics team. And I think that's where you and I first became acquainted back in 2020, 2021, in advance of its release.
I think that's about right, David. That's about, I've known you for about 3 or 4 years. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Too bad, pity we didn't cross paths in Hong Kong. That was a good film you did there, detailing how China was immersed with Bordeaux. But it's now, there's issues of its Australian wines have made quite a mark over there, and there's some trade issues that have seemed to have been resolved. I have been graced with 7 bottles of some of Australia's top wines, as recommended by Andrew, which have been provided by the very kind folks at Wine Boat here in the United States. And of course, its various suppliers, especially the Henschke family, with whom I have a long camaraderie with. And Andrew, I got to thank you that you and Winebow and the producers, of course, for supplying these top-notch, world-class, by any measure, Australian wines that I'll be tasting here today, which you know intimately, which I only have a passing familiarity with. But I have no doubt, based upon writings that you and others have put forth and the few tastings I've had of these wines, I'm going to have a fantastic weekend ahead of me with the leftovers, no doubt. As someone who has dabbled in authordom, what advice or assistance did you receive over your 18 years from trained historians, professors and doctors and such in your development? What assistance or advice did you receive in your efforts to best understand and convey the story of these cherished wines?
The short answer is none, but the long answer is that during the editing phase, the publishing phase, so the manuscript's finished, right? And there is a period of getting your manuscript into shape for publishing. And there are some very sensitive issues that come with Australian history, including the plight of First Nations people, And I was very keen to make sure that all angles were covered and that all sensitivities were checked, and to make sure that it was an all-round balanced book. And when we actually went through the editing process, we brought in a number of historians, particularly a guy called Dr. Stephen Gapp, who's a renowned historian for First Nations and also early colonial history. And he was absolutely brilliant because there were a few little things that needed to be revised or elaborated on. And so he was absolutely brilliant. And I had all sorts of different people, archivists and stuff like that. So it is true, a manuscript of this size does need some advisory assistance work. But in terms of actually writing the book, I did it from scratch, and I was doing all of the research and stuff like that. And I wasn't consulting with historians or anybody while I was doing that.
Given the look-see I've had at it so far, that I can understand why it took you 18 years. See, even a professional historian, that would be a daunting task, what you've achieved here with the Australian.
Yeah. When I started it, the ambition was to write a book called The Classic Wines of Australia. And it was meant to be an homage to a book that had been written in 1966 by a very famous vigneron here in New South Wales called Dr. Max Lake. And yes, he was, I knew him pretty well actually when he was alive. And I felt that the book needed to be updated. It was a wonderful book. It's a really cozy, historic Australian wine. And he was a friend of my grandmother, and he shared a lot of the wines with my grandmother, who came, as you were saying, from the Rhinecliff family. So she had a lot of old bottles going back to the early part of the 1900s. And he mentioned them. For me, that was the logical thing to do. But I then stopped after a little while because the business that I was involved in, Langton's, which was an auction house here in Australia, it got taken over by a large supermarket group, and I knew my world was going to change. So I dabbled here and there on history, bits and pieces, and then I really got going again big time 8 years ago with the objective of writing a complete history of Australian wine.
Aside from what must be a tremendous amount that you learned over this period of time, what preconceptions were you surprised to have to abandon? Kind of flipping that around a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Because of my history as a professional wine auctioneer, I'm already an historian because I'm dealing with really old bottles of wine all the time. I'm having to find out about them, the famous wines like Penfolds 1962 Bin 60A. There's so many of those types of wines, and all the old Maurice O'Shea wines, they're really important. And you just land up knowing about these things. And then, of course, growing up, in your introduction, you mentioned me as being a Brit. I am, but I'm half Australian. My mother's Australian. And as you were saying, I've got a very strong Australian background. So even though I was growing up in the UK and America, by the way, I lived in Washington, D.C. for 3 years as a child, we were very cognizant of our family background, particularly the Rhinells and everything like that. I had all of this received wisdom, if you like, about Australian wine. So I actually had a kind of framework in the back of my mind when I was writing about it. But like with all research, you go down all sorts of rabbit holes, and you suddenly realize that this history is so fascinating and so romantic and so beautiful, because it really is. It was just captivating. I just could not stop researching. It was just wonderful. And here we are talking digitally between Sydney and New York. It's the same thing. This book could never have been written in the analog age. I can go searching on the internet through the Australian National Library website called Trove, and I can find almost every single newspaper published since the very, very first newspaper was published here in New South Wales.
So anybody wants to fact check your work and can do the same.
Yeah. But that's one of the big pitfalls about relying on newspaper articles and stuff like this, is that reporters they're renowned for misspelling place names and people's names and stuff like this. And when it comes to actually publishing a book like this, with all the fact checking, everything that you do, the cross-referencing and stuff like that, you just cannot avoid having spelling mistakes. It's really the second edition that we can have to do that, where we can absolutely iron out all those little details.
From the the first British who landed there in the 18th century. I'm curious as to what other European cultural influences over the years, those people who migrated to Australia, what sort of impact did the different European cultures, aside from the original British colonial settlers,
Yeah.
have upon the development of viticulture?
That's a very interesting question. And before I quickly go into it, the early settlers, as you will quite rightly point out, were mainly British, English, and Scottish, particularly in the very earliest days. And the big problem is that they didn't really have a big wine culture, and they were ill-equipped to really become vignerons. And so they used, in the very early days, a couple of French prisoners of war that they managed to get off a hulk kind of prison ship in the Thames. And they professed that they knew all about growing grapes and all that kind of stuff. But I think when they arrived in New South Wales, they proved to be pretty useless. And I think that they were just trying to get off the hulk and thought going to live in New South Wales was a much better option for a longer life than dying in a hulk and all sorts of diseases you'd get there. But that was really the earliest. And there was also a guy called Philip Schaefer, who was a German mercenary who came in very early on with the first fleets. And he landed up being, using that phrase for the first time, being a vigneron at Rose Hill near Parramatta. And he made Australia's very first wine in New South Wales in 1792 that was taken back to Europe as a curio by Governor Arthur Phillip as a curio. And we're not 100% sure whether it was made, but there's enough evidence to suggest that it was. So in my book, it's the first wine in this canon of Australian wine, which is the spine of the narrative. The first grapevines were planted in New South Wales with the first fleet. We know that there's enough recording. What's really interesting about Western Australia is that vines were planted there in 1829. So they were planted before vines were planted in South Australia. And interestingly, if you remember the mutiny of the Bounty with Captain Bligh, a lot of your listeners will probably remember the film, at least, with
two excellent versions, as I recall.
Yeah, two excellent versions. When Captain Bligh was going on that voyage, he stopped at a place called Adventure Bay in 1788 in Tasmania, which was then known as Van Diemen's Land. And he planted some vines in a garden that was typical for explorers to establish kitchen gardens and stuff like this when they were sorting out their ships when they were in a long way away, when they'd have to scrape off barnacles and stuff and often have to hang around for 6 to 8 weeks. And so a lot of explorers, that's what they used to do, so that they could leave things for other explorers. The influence you were just saying about other Europeans, Germans were really very important. They started coming in very early on because England and Germany were very closely connected, especially during Victorian times. Victoria was married to Prince Albert, who was German, and basically the English royal family were of German origins. And so there was a lot of connections that were going in those parts. Of course, Germany wasn't unified at that time, but they came out very early and worked at a place called Camden Park in southwest Sydney. They were also brought up to help establish vineyards in the Hunter Valley in the 1820s. Then during the 1840s, there were a lot of Germans that emigrated to South Australia. And of course, they're famous for establishing the Barossa Valley's reputation over the last 100 years. So the Germans were there, a lot of French people as well, particularly during the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, when sparkling wine became a very big thing. So a lot of champagne makers came along, including a guy called Frank Jaunet, who was related to the Krug family. He was a Franco-Irishman, and he was persuaded by his brothers to emigrate out to Australia, and so he sold all the family assets to Krug, and who were cousins, and the Krug family gave them a stipend of £100 per year until their death to be able to use their brand name and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of connections between Australia and Europe, and even going right into the current days, there's still a lot of relationships between winemakers here and winemakers in Europe. And the most obvious ones are Domaine Chandon, who are based in the Yarra Valley.
Using the mention of Germans as a good segue
Yeah,
into my tasting these wines here, Robert Hill Smith and his company have kindly at Pusey Vale have provided not one but two Rieslings, a grape variety that is inextricably linked with Germany and the Germanic-speaking lands of Central Europe. I
yes.
have with me here today a 2023 dry Riesling and a 2022 1961 block Riesling, both from the Eden Valley. I have
Yeah.
tasted them already poured here. If you could please loop in here the history of Riesling and the Eden Valley and these wines I'm tasting today from Pusey Vale.
One of the most important figures in the Australian wine history is a person called William MacArthur, who became known as Sir William MacArthur. And he was the son of John MacArthur. And John MacArthur also a very important colonial pioneer settler and who brought the first merino sheep into Australia. So is often credited with being the founder of Australia's
Wool, yeah.
wool
Merino
yeah.
sheep, for those who aren't aware, is best associated not so much for their flesh, but for their hair, their wool.
That's exactly right. And so he became very powerful. There was a coup d'etat that took place in New South Wales in 1808, and he took William and his other son James back to England, and then he had to account for himself because what he had done was treason, but he managed to get away with it. And on his way back, he picked up a whole lot of vine stock material, 1815, 1816, and brought it back to his property at Camden Park, southwest of Sydney, in 1817. But 3 years after they planted their nursery at Camden Park, they realized that a lot of the grapevine stock that they had picked up was not exactly what had been shipped. So there'd been some form of switcheroo or some skullduggery that had happened in between. And so as a consequence to that, the MacArthur family also sponsored a very important figure in Australian wine history called James Busby to go and to Europe and to collect more vine stock material. The foundation of Australia's vine stock story is very much steeped into this 1832 importation, which we'll probably talk about a couple of times through your tasting. But one of the problems with that, although he brought 437 different types of vine stock, which is a slightly slippery figure because we actually don't know, not all of them really survived, but it became very patently very clear that there were some deficiencies in what was being brought in. And so William MacArthur, the son, by this time was running Camden Estate and running the nurseries. He was an extraordinary human being. They were short of Bordeaux varieties, particularly Cabernet Sauvignon. And so he brought the Cabernet Sauvignon in 1837, but he also got his brother to organize a shipment of Riesling to come out to New South Wales in 1838 with a whole gang of vignerons or vine dressers, as they used to call them, from the Mark vineyard in the Rhine, on the Rhine Valley, in the Rheingau, to come and work at Camden Estate. So they were really the first German vine dressers to arrive. And the Riesling first came in 1838 into New South Wales. And William MacArthur was a really interesting person because he planted a nursery and he had a business distributing vine stock all over colonial Australia. So it went into Port Phillip, which later became known as Victoria, but also into South Australia. And one of the recipients of the vine stock was a guy called Joseph Gilbert, who was a very prosperous landowner, originally from Wiltshire in England, who bought this beautiful property and named it Pusey Vale. And he ran racehorses up there, and he had a kind of mixed farm. It's a lovely, beautiful, rolling country above the Barossa Valley, a little bit more cooler and more English looking, for want of a better word. And he planted the first vine stock there in the 1840s. And because of phylloxera never coming into South Australia and because of strict quarantine laws that were introduced in the 80s, in 1875 to be precise, there was very little vine stock that really came into South Australia really until the 1970s. So anything that was planted before the 1970s, the vine stock material was basically genetic vine stock material that derived from that original importation in 1838. So that's basically the story behind the Pusey Vale.
Fantastic. So not only does the overall history of viticulture in Australia, certainly with vinifera and an unbroken line of quality vinifera being produced, predate that of the US, it also has done so without any appreciable impact by phylloxera.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think this is one of the things that one of the highlights of this conversation should be, is that Australia, and particularly South Australia, but Australia as a general country, has the largest surviving acreage of mid-19th century to early 20th century vineyards, direct producing vineyards in the world. We have the
to this day, and I think I have a few drops in some of these bottles I have here today.
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why. A good example about the Pewsey Vale is the vines go back, as you've seen, you've got the 90s block. Obviously, it was planted in 1961. But the point about this beautiful vineyard, which is contour planted in this elevated, beautiful part of the Barossa and the Eden Valley.
I think my notes here say that's planted on a north-south orientation.
Yeah, but it contours around. Yeah, that particular block. It's the most beautiful vineyard, one of the most beautiful vineyards in the world, because the vines just hug the contours, and it's highly elevated with the hills around it, and it's very Australian setting, but it's beautiful. But the genetic vine stock is precisely the same as the material that was brought out in 1838, because you've got to remember is that vines are planted with cuttings, not seeds. And although with epigenetics and everything like that, the vines adapt to their environment, the DNA of the stock is identical to the 1838 importation.
I have to say, just a quick comments about these wines. I've tasted the standard Pewsey Vale dry Riesling over the years. The 2023 is no slouch upon previous vintages. For those of you caring about costs, it's a U.S. Suggested retail of $22, eminently affordable, certainly up there with the best dry Rieslings of the world. And from my experience, it ages on the midterm pretty well. It's not, in my experience, a real long-term aging sort of wine, but if you're so inclined, put it away for 4 or 5 years, it will open up and produce a lot more diversity of flavors and aromas than it has at the moment, which admittedly, it's on the lean and tight side at the moment. However, the 2022 1961 block, different story altogether. Still young as it is, it's screaming with aromas right now. It's lots of fun. As soon as you smell it and on the palate, it follows through on the promise of the nose. Now, structurally, it's got a lot more going on in terms of a little bit of residual sugar as compared to the standard dry Riesling, and a little bit more acidity as well, telling me that not only does it taste great young, this is going to age beautifully for more time than the standard dry Riesling is destined to. Would you concur or you differ on that?
I'm not going to, I'm not going to point out your expertise, David, because your perceptions, my perceptions might be slightly different, but basically we're on the same page, right? But yes, no, absolutely. And the main thing about these wines are the precision behind them. They have that beautiful acid line that gives it freshness and mineral length. The Pewsey Vales, that dry Riesling is such a great example of Eden Valley Riesling. It's not expensive. These wines are always best drunk with a couple of years of bottle age because they get this slight toastiness and the palate fills out on the middle, as you well know. So I think your description is pretty bang on. But being mostly your listeners are Americans, I think the point should be is that these are what you would call late picked dry Riesling styles. They have lovely buoyancy on account of their level of alcohol in them. And they have this, and they're just wonderful. And they're just a wonderful foil to Rieslings that come from the classic areas in Europe. But the precision of the wines and the purity of fruits make these wines really special. I absolutely love them.
I'm with you there. Precision and purity, two excellent words to apply to these.
Yeah.
It's worth mentioning that a recent guest of ours was responsible for the overall making of these wines, Ms. Louisa Rose, spoke in our session on sparkling pinks we did a couple months back.
And, she's a wonderful winemaker. Wonderful.
She really carried her part, and it was a big discussion. It was herself and a few other folks from around the globe talking about pink bubblies, and the Jan's wines really stood out beautifully.
Yeah.
So yeah, so good shout out to Louisa. And so moving
Totally.
on here, you made a mention earlier about the First Nations folk and
Mm.
the detail you had to pay to it. A shout out to you and the Australian folks and your neighbors across the Tasman Sea and New Zealand for your attention and care for what you are doing these days as opposed to the past. I only wish my fellow Americans would have the same consideration for this. We're not quite there as of yet. We have different history and different ethos about all that. It needs to
Mm.
be improved. And mentioning the First Peoples, the First Nation peoples there in Australia, what impact, if any, can you say, aside from their manual labor, which was either given willingly or not, did they have in terms of providing information, guidance, wisdom of any kind? Is there any record of this in your research, or is this something
Yeah,
that
there is.
left
There,
aside?
there's a very good example actually in the Barossa Valley when the first German settlers arrived in the Barossa Valley, and some established a small township down near Lindok, and the Aboriginals said you shouldn't be settling there, and they did anyway, and they basically got flooded out. They just So yes, that type of thing coming along, but I think it's despite kind of things written by another historian, wine writer who you would know, Max Allen, who's talking about the Aboriginals drinking some kind of wine, kind of alcohol. Anything that's got sugar in will ferment naturally. That's particularly rocket science. But the culture of wine is not an Aboriginal kind of thing. But during the very earliest days of colonial settlement, as you quite rightly point out, there were a lot of Aboriginal laborers that were working alongside. We have convicts that were working on vineyards, and certainly through the ages, the Aboriginal people were working. They were marvelous stockmen, and there were a number that were absolutely brilliant. But in terms of opportunities, when you're looking at them, you're really just seeing more inclusion happening in the last 30 or 40 years. And there is a move within the wine industry to encourage people from all backgrounds to share in the future of the Australian wine industry. Yeah.
That's also the case in New Zealand. I came to discover in recent years that there's a big movement over there in that direction as well. Happy to see that. Fortunately, I cannot say the same here in the United States. The amount of native folks who are venturing into wine seems to be on the low end.
It is on the low end here as well.
Yeah.
But the thing is that what's being done is really preparing the landscape for more involvement. The population of First Nations people here in Australia, for those people who connect themselves to the Aboriginal First Nations culture, is roughly 1 million people who have got some form of ancestry connection with First Nations people. And that's a significant number of people in Australia's population. Of course, inclusion has to happen.
Mm. So keeping it to the white varieties, Riesling is my personal preference one. However, there's something that Australia does uniquely and more of it than it with a grape variety that, in my experience, no other place in the world does, and that is Semillon. And I've tasted many great versions from many great producers. However, the one that is always I keep coming back to is the Terrell family, and that one Semillon I have here, the 2017, graciously provided by the folks at Broadbent Wines. Bart Beaulieu was another guest of ours here drinking.
I met his dad. As did
I when I lived in London once. Yeah.
in 1979 when I was doing vintage in Bordeaux. And that was the very first time I met Michael Broadbent, and he was a bit of a hero to me because what he was doing was what I wanted to do, and I landed up being a wine auctioneer as well. And then I met him a few times after that, another time at a cricket match in the Hunter Valley when I was working vintage at Brokenwood in 1984.
Now that's a terrific winery, Brokenwood. I like that.
Yeah, that's right. So that's it. I've never met Bartholomew, but I've followed his career with interest simply because of that connection.
Oh, he's a terrific fellow, terrific interview, to be sure.
Yeah. But Tyrrell's Fat Wine is a really interesting wine. It's really the reference, a bit like Pusey Vale is the reference for Riesling, along with Grosset Perlichil. Tyrrell's Vat Wine is the reference for Hunter River or Hunter Valley Semillon, which was originally known as Shepherd's Riesling. And this was a vine stock that came into New South Wales at the very earliest days of settlement, because the settlers used to go by ship, and the route was from England via the Canary Islands or Madeira, but normally the Canary Islands, then via the Cape Colony or Cape Town, South Africa, as most people know it today, and then across the Indian Ocean and underneath the Great Southern Bight and into up the East Coast into Sydney. And that was the regular run. And on their way, settlers used to pick up vine stock material from Cape Town and take it to New South Wales. We don't actually know when the first Semillon was brought into the country because of records and all of that kind of stuff. But what's really interesting is the vine stock that material, genetic vine stock material, it derives from material that was found in a garden, the front garden of a house in Pyrmont, which is just around the corner from where I'm living right now, which is today a very inner suburb of Sydney and juts out into Sydney Harbour, and where a lot of ships would have been coming in as well. And he saw this vine that was particularly verdant and growing particularly well. And so he snipped with his pocket knife, because secateurs didn't exist in those days, with his pocket knife, some cuttings from this particular vine, and he went and put it into his Darlington nursery, which wasn't so far away, and propagated them. And then once he had enough cuttings, he then sent them up to a place called Irrawang into the Hunter Valley in the 1820s. And this material was then shared around the Hunter Valley. And this is how Shepherd's Riesling became very popular, because it was such a successful grape variety for the kind of slightly humid growing climate in the Hunter Valley. And it then became known as Hunter River Riesling. And then through ampelography, and people knew that it was Semillon by the 1940s, that's a fact. But it was still called Hunter River Riesling right up until the 1970s and early 1980s. And then, of course, with European laws and all sorts of things, and an ampelographer coming out, it was switched over to Semillon. But what's so fascinating is just that particular history, that you can actually track it all the way back there, which you can't do with many other parts of the world. And what's interesting about that one also with the Semillon is a part of the material that goes into that wine is from a vineyard that was planted which is well over 100 years ago. And it's a surviving direct producing Semillon, and it's still producing exquisite fruits. And I just think that's absolutely astonishing. Phylloxera never got to the Hunter Valley, which is incredible, because it's all around Sydney, but it's never, ever got to the Hunter Valley. And I cannot give you any reason why. The connections between Sydney and the Hunter Valley, when I first arrived here in the early 1980s, it would take 3 hours or 3.5 hours to drive up these single lane roads. Now there's major highway going up, and it takes a couple of hours at the most to get up to the Hunter Valley. The rapid transport, the chances of getting phylloxera are so much higher, but it hasn't happened. It's astonishing.
My experience with Tyrrell's wines, especially the Semillons, certainly was illuminated during my time living in London in the noughties. And I had the pleasure of, for the Circle of Wine Writers, organizing some of its events, wine tasting events. And we had one that was around the London Wine Fair. And I was able to put together with Bruce Tyrrell and a few other of Hunter Valley's best producers, a seated formal tasting of multiple vintages of both Semillon and Shiraz from the Hunter Valley. And one of the marvels was tasting older vintages of this exact wine. The 2017 is the current release. It is showing wonderful complexity at this age. However, I know from experience, and you'll bear me out with this, I hope, that it can develop immensely with more years of aging in a proper conditions and develop much more levels of complexity of structure and aroma and feel. It is one of the most underrated white wine varieties, especially when it's performing as well as it does in the Hunter Valley.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I did a vertical tasting not so long ago, and I was absolutely fascinated and absorbed by it because they really do transform into the most extraordinary wine, almost like a metamorphosis, like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis. It's extraordinary.
Well,
And they are the most beautiful wines, but they were always regarded as something that would be, with age, that they develop this really toasty lanolin complexity. They get more volume on the palate, and they're more mouth-filling when they're a bit older, and they have this lovely acidity in terms of the length. The alcohols are not very high. They're only around 11.5%, 12%. And so they're very moderately to low alcohol wines. And since the screw cap revolution, you can be pretty well assured that they can last a good 20 or 30 years. The problem when they were under cork was some would last forever, but some others wouldn't. But the screw cap almost guarantees that they'll age really beautifully. And that one is the absolute reference. The other one is the Mount Pleasant Lovedale, which comes from a 1940s planted vineyard. But I always think of Tyrrell's that one as being the reference for the Hunter Valley in terms of Semillon.
Most certainly is. And you comment about the wine being screw capped. It bears mentioning that all of the wines that I'm tasting here are under screw cap. None have been corked, finished, which you would not find so common in most parts of the world, certainly not here in the U.S. for wines of this caliber. The Tyrrell's 2017 That Semillon, not an everyday wine. It's retailing here for about $70 US, but it is a wine for a special occasion and well worth it. Finishing off our whites, we're going to step into a more commonly known grape, and one that's certainly more affordable. The Howard Park Chardonnay. This one has a name affiliated with it that I can't pronounce correctly. What's that name? It's got Miamup. Is it Miamup?
Miamup.
Yeah, and this is from the Margaret River, which is not, it's the other side. It's the western side of Australia, correct?
That's right. Yeah. And it's a marvelous family-owned winery established by a couple called Jeff and Amy Birch. And they've been massive protagonists for the ultra-fine wine scene in Margaret River. The reason why I chose this is because the story of Chardonnay in Margaret River is wonderful, fascinating, extraordinary. And in fact, there's an American connection with it. During the 1950s, vine stock material from California was brought out as a virus indicator and planted at a place called, which is just north of Perth, where they established a vine nursery. And while it was there, the vine stock was obviously, cuttings were taken and planted down in the Margaret River during the 1970s. And it's proven to be massively successful. The particular characteristics of this particular selection is that it ripens in a way in which you have small berries and large berries, also known as hen and chicken here, but the Americans would probably know as Millerandard. Mm-hmm. And the consequence to that is that the wines, aside from their beautiful aromatics, they also have this al dente kind of texture, which gives the wines extraordinary torque and length. And also there's a very high level of natural acidity.
Oh, yeah.
And this particular clone, the gin clone, has been massively successful in Margaret River and is the absolute foundation of its success. They are some of the most prized white wines in Australia, and they are easy to identify because of their weight, their precision, and their absolutely beguiling aromatics. But what's so fascinating about the gin clone is that it came from the original source block was from the Armstrong vineyard in the University of Davis in California. And we know that vineyard, which has now been grubbed up, was planted in the 1930s with vine stock that came from the Wente vineyard in the Livermore in California. And
Okay,
then
so this
and
has
we
a
know,
so this has a
yeah,
family connection to the Wente clone, as we call it here.
yeah, that's right. And then the Wente clone or the Chardonnay was came from Meursault in. So what's so fascinating about the Gingin clone and Margaret River Chardonnay, if there was any area, any region in the world which would have a similarity to Margaret River Chardonnay, would be Meursault.
Hmm.
And I just thought that just extraordinary that there is somehow through the genetic vine stock code and the happenstance of epigenetics, you've got a style that's quite similar to Meursault. And so so there's the family resemblance to its origins is extraordinary.
Yeah, well, I have to say this 2023 version, it's the youngest vintage available, it's quite drinkable at the moment, but as you mentioned, the acidity is still high, and even the aromatics are very appealing and
Yeah.
enjoyable at the moment. Yeah, you can drink the wine now, but this is set to age beautifully for a handful of years, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And again, this is suggested retail price here is US $20. Now, when you compare that to a lot of other wines that are made here in the US for Chardonnay at that price, in IMO, this beats the pants off of most of them, and both for current consumption and put it down, let it rest for a few years consumption. I'm enjoying this, and I'm looking forward to leaving this to the end of the week next week and seeing how this develops in my refrigerator after.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's funny, isn't it, when you're doing tasting wines and stuff like that, because like you, and talk about wine and taste and stuff like that. But I did a tasting the other day of some wines from McLaren Vale from Toby Becker's, which is a wonderful estate. And I was tasting their Grenache, Shiraz Grenache, and their Grenache and a Shiraz. And I wrote very good tasting notes. And we're a little bit more generous with our scores in Australia than you are in the United States. But I left them open and I drank them the following day. And boy, did they look better a day later, which really highlights it's a good idea to cellar the wines for a couple of years before you drink them, right? Because it allows it all to settle in and everything like that. Or open the bottle up and then take a glass out on day one and then and enjoy the rest of the bottle on day two.
Absolutely. On that note, I'd have to admit I did open the Tyrrell's that one last night. Had to have a little bit, give it a bit of oxygen. See how it developed today. It shifted already. It was opening up today. I'm looking forward to using some restraint and allowing it to have a few more days before I try it again. So we don't bump into our time end too soon. Let's move into the red world. And
can I interrupt one moment, because I know that the 10 minutes by Tractor Pinot Noir didn't come in, and just as a quick one about Pinot Noir in Australia, I think it's really interesting comment, because Pinot Noir came into New South Wales as early as 1788, 1789, and the vine stock material didn't come from France; it came from England, because Pinot Noir was a common wall garden variety. And so in England, and it's highly likely, we do know that it came in early because a wine that was based on Pinot Noir won the first international medal in the 1820s back in London. And it was a brush farm. Would you believe it was called Claret, but it was actually made from Pinot Noir, and it won a silver medal. And then a couple of years later, a similar wine won a gold medal. But James Busby's importation in 1832, he picked up wine from the Clos Veugeot. And at the time, and in the 1830s, the Clos Veugeot was owned by one family. And that family also, by coincidence, owned the Romney Conti vineyard. Mm-hmm. And anyway, just cut a long story short, this fine stock material was planted out in Hunter Valley. It was then planted into Kirkton Vineyard, which was the family vineyard of James Busby's. It was then, cuttings were taken by Maurice O'Shea in the 1920s before that vineyard was grubbed up. And then cuttings were taken by the CSIRO in the 1960s. A selection was made, and in the early 1970s, the clone MV6 was introduced to Australian vignerons to plant in Australia. And so that material's got a history going back to the Clos Bergeau, and even with a slightly romantic connection to the Romani Conti vineyard. And it has been the most successful clone planted on the east coast of Australia. And the wine that we were meant to taste, or you were meant to taste, and you will eventually, because I'm probably get there, is based on that clone, and that's why I wanted it there.
Yeah, no, I can fully appreciate that. My first visit to Australia included some time, coincidentally, during Mornington Peninsula's annual Pinot Noir festival. And unfortunately, 10 Minutes by Tractor was, I think, at its nascency. I didn't have a chance to visit. However, I had the great pleasure to taste their wines living in London soon after. And shout out to Gabby Richardson for her attempts. Australian Pinot Noir is having its moment. I know for a fact that Wine Australia has that front and center in its promotions. And I'm happy to give hands up to them for doing so. Australian Pinot Noir has been on a long but very estimable journey in quality and building up what's doing. The Mornington Peninsula being the epicenter for Pinot Noir in Australia, as far as I know. But moving away from that, we have in my glass at the moment another work by Louisa Rose, the Yalumba Tricentenary, which is
Tricentenary,
2019.
This is a beautiful vineyard, which is in the heart of the Barossa Valley, which was really founded in the 1840s. And the Hill Smith family established Yalumba in 1849, and the family still owns. It's still family owned. And as you were mentioning, Robert Hill Smith is the proprietor, a wonderful intellect who's played such an important role in the promotion and quality of Australian wine. But this vineyard itself was planted in 1889, and there's about 840 surviving direct producing Grenache vines that are planted there. And right adjacent to the vineyard is also another vineyard owned by Marco Cirillo that was planted in 1848. And so probably some of the oldest surviving Grenache vines, if not the oldest surviving Grenache vines in the world, which is incredible. But going back to the Tricentenary Grenache, this is the vine stock material is directly related to the 18 Busby importation, and it's, of course, again, it survived because of South Australia's extraordinary quarantine rules. The wine this is a classic example also of a wine that gets better and better in the glass. I'm not tasting it in front of me, so I can't see it, but I'm imagining the colors are quite light. Grenache is often, some critics often call Grenache, particularly in Australia's kind of warm climate, Pinot Noir, because the aromatics are very similar to Pinot Noir. You can get these very kind of lovely red fruit, strawberry aromatics, and of course there's a silkiness on the palate, but the alcohols are generally a little bit more elevated. What's it looking like, David?
It's as far as appearance goes, it is steering away from the purple blue and a little bit more to the red. Purple's still there. A few months ago, we did have an episode on Grenache, and we had Chester Osborne representing Australia, and represented he did, of course. But this wine was actually mentioned in that conversation as well. And this is another one I opened last night and had a taste of, and I was blown away. And today is delicious and amazing smell. It was yet last night. It's more so today. Again, like the Torrells, not an everyday sort of wine. It's certainly a good special occasion, long enjoying kind of wine at about 70 SRP here. So yeah.
What's really incredible when you taste wine like this, you can't taste a wine like this out of the Rhone Valley. You can't, because the vines aren't that old. Simple as that. This is from vine stock that was planted nearly 140 years ago. When you really think about it in those days, and this is the thing about South Australian wine, and what we as a country need to push more vigorously is that these wines are unique, and you can buy them at a price that's commensurate to ultra premium wine, but not these hugely massive expensive wines that are being charged for in Europe. And they are still incredibly good value wines, where the actual vine material has got a history it's longer than that in Europe. I just find that just so amazing.
Oh, absolutely. It certainly is. I'm not trying to pose it against something from the Rhone.
No, I wasn't suggesting that at all. This was just my viewpoint. And the whole point about this tasting is Australia has got this extraordinary story of heirloom vineyards and heirloom vine stock. And it's just not, there's nothing like it in the world.
Oh,
Chile,
no, there certainly isn't. I remember visiting Jumilla, Spain, and about a few years back, and they were telling me as old as the oldest vines they have there, they know full well that the oldest Mataro or Mourvedre is in Australia.
Yeah. And that's because of the problems with phylloxera, of course. And yeah, very interesting. But Chile's got older vines than Australia has. They've got a lot of the variety Pegs, and some of those vines are a bit older. So we're not claiming that, but we have the largest acreage and probably the most, because of the varieties that we have, particularly Shiraz, Mataro, Grenache, Mataro being Mourvedre, of course, Cabernet Sauvignon, all those things. They're Semillon, they're all classic varieties, right? There's a connection that can easily be established between Australia and customers on the international market.
Certainly. Before we slip into Shiraz, a variety which Australia has long been well associated, my comment about the Yalumba Grenache I'm tasting right now, you mentioned the silkiness there. It's absolutely there. The tannin structure of a great many of the best Grenache from South Australia, Barossa Valley in particular, and this one as well. Tannin structure, again, it's a wine of great depth and concentration, but the tannins are not at all imposing. They are silky, they are soft. They add one more element of balance to this wine. The complexity of aromas and flavors is tremendous. The acids are absolutely there, putting the backbone in the wine. And again, the tannins, it's Grenache, but Grenache can be hard in some places, a little harder or denser tannins. Here they're not. They are, again, silky, goes down easy. The wine is delicious at the moment, but again, 2019, what's your experience been? Are the greatest Grenaches in Australia and this part of Australia? Will they last decades and show more things that they're not showing in their youth?
I think that I prefer Grenache when it's moderately young. I
Mhm.
think going back to what our conversations were beforehand, they do benefit from, because I think these types of wines sometimes are released a bit too early. And that's always the case when you're tasting them, and you taste a glass one day and then the next day the wine's got even better. And I think this is a good example. Grenache is like that. There are a number of Grenaches produced in South Australia. McLaren Vale and the Barossa are probably the two major areas where there are larger, older plantings. But in the Barossa's got the oldest plantings of Grenache in the whole of the country, whereas in McLaren Vale, there are plantings that go back to the 30s and 1940s. But I think generally that Grenache is not really, they keep for a long time, but I think optimum drinking, I think a 2 to 6 year kind of period is really the best for the best enjoyment, in my view. But then there's always an outlier, a great vintage or something that's quite lean and minerally and doesn't really full itself. There's always a surprise, but just generally, as a comment, I would say 2 to 6 years.
Yeah, on our Grenache, that was a point of conversation on our Grenache episode between Chester and Doug Frost from Washington State.
Oh yeah,
His Echo Lands project. Doug was often in the opinion that, yeah, as well, I can drink it young, I can drink it older, but sometimes it's the youngest expression of Australian Grenaches are the most delightful.
They have this buoyancy of this beautiful ripe fruit. And that's what I love so much about it. We were talking about it being like warm climate Pinot Noir. Those aromatics, the kind of strawberry, red cherry, Kinotto type of aromatics, and then that kind of fleshiness, and that we were talking about the silkiness on the palate. Just such delightful wines. I love drinking them. They're beautiful.
It's like taking a little bit of a tangent here from our keeping down the line of the wines and where they're from and all that. I'm wondering, was wine grape production traditionally relegated to a monocultural model, or in Australia, or was it once like its European forebears, based on the polycultural production model that is interspersed with the growing of crops and animal husbandry for solid and liquid foods? We hear
That
about.
is a
Yeah.
that is about one of the best questions I've had
Ah,
since just because it's a really interesting one. I haven't thought about it, but I can give you a very good answer for it though, because I've written about it, but hadn't done that connection. And the Barossa is a very good example. During the 18th, the Barossa was settled by both English settlers and German settlers. And the German settlers established mixed farms, exactly how you're saying, along what they call the Huffendorf system. So if you can imagine a block of land, you would have your house, you would then have behind it, you would have your kitchen garden, you would have your orchard, you would have your vine garden of kind of wine grapes, and then you would have your pigs or your sheep or whatever it was. And also the Germans, they really were brilliant at supporting each other. So their communities would also share land to farm. And if one family wasn't doing so well with one crop or whatever, they would share. The English settlers were generally more wealthy, and they had larger holdings of land. And rather than planting with grapes and mixed farms, most of them planted with cereal crops, wheat and barley in particular. And so the Barossa in the 1840s, when it was being established, did not look like it does today, where you see it's everywhere. It was mixed farms. But the problem with the English farmers is that they couldn't farm sustainably. And so although they were getting bumper crops in the early days, over time, erosion and the kind of fertility of the soils was getting worse and worse, not to mention rust diseases and stuff like this. And so their yields diminished, and then they became less profitable, and then they sold their land up because they couldn't farm successfully in the Barossa Valley. And some of this land was subdivided, and some of it was bought by Germans, and the German settlers, and they planted vineyards. So the answer is that the mixed farming model was a far more sustainable way of production during the 1800s than mono, and that's been proven right round. But it's interesting because your question, no one's ever asked me that question, and yet it's such an important question because it also, in terms of the Barossa, shaped its cultural identity, and I think that's fascinating.
It goes back again to my first visit, which is 17 years ago. But I actually was contracted to write a few different things about more than just wine. I wrote about the seafood of
Oh yeah.
Australia, and I got a chance to visit some oyster farms and do and wild oyster harvesting as well. And of course, I went to the Sydney Fish Market.
Oh
Whoa!
yes.
Oh yeah, I got a behind the scenes tour from the manager. That was something. But I also,
By the way, that fish market is just about to be knocked down.
I
They have just there in the middle. It will be finished next year. They are building the most magnificent looking building, and it's going to be more like some of those beautiful Spanish markets
oh yeah,
in Madrid and everything like that. It's just going to be amazing, absolutely amazing.
more
Yeah.
polished version of the
Yeah.
warehousing site.
Yeah, exactly. A lot more
Vegas.
polished.
So I just want to add quickly that I was also contracted to write a story for a British publication about Australian olives and olive oil. And
Oh, yes.
yeah, even back then, Australia was producing enough olive oil that the Waitrose supermarkets were being supplied with their own brand Australian olive oil. And if
Yeah.
that's a lot of quality olive oil, and it was extra
Yeah.
virgin on top of that. So there you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we do produce a lot of olive oil here, and my wife only will buy Australian olive oil now. But it's really interesting. 10 years ago, olive oil, the extra virgin olive oil, was really quite cheap, and it's become very expensive now. There are a lot of vignerons. There are a lot of vignerons in Australia that make olive oil, and Vanya Cullen is one of them in Western Australia, in Margaret River. And the other is my friend Warwick Ross and Margot Ross at Portsea Estate in Mornington Peninsula, who I made Red Obsession and Blind Ambition with them.
Right,
And
right.
they make a beautiful olive oil from their little estate.
Another reason to return. Okay,
Yeah.
moving along.
Yeah.
Something that a wine and a family that have a special place in my heart, and
Yes.
certainly in the hearts of all wine-loving Australians. the Henschke family and their Mount Edelstone Shiraz. I have here the 2018 bottle. This is quite a gem historically. Give us a little background about Shiraz in Eden Valley and the Mount Edelstone in particular, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, of course. Shiraz, just shortcutting the story of Shiraz. The first Shiraz vine stock brought into New South Wales was in 1830, but it's actually the 1832 importation by James Busby that was really profound. And the material that was planted at the Mount Edelstone vineyard is probably material that relates to James Busby. No one knows quite where the material came from for planting, but it might have come from Pewsey Vale or somewhere around there. But certainly because of the quarantine regulations, it would be related to that material. The Mount Edelstone vineyard was originally planted by the Angus family in 1912 by Ronald Angus. And it's in a particularly beautiful, isolated site in the Eden Valley. And when the Henschkes acquired the vineyard, I think it was in the 1960s or somewhere around there, they have nurtured it to what it is. Prue Henschke's work in the vineyard, both in the Hill of Grace vineyard and the Mount Edelstone vineyard, is just simply extraordinary what she's done. They've done special vine selections wherever there's gaps in the vineyard for the trellising, the work done on every single level of vine management. They've gone towards a biodynamic regime, which is extraordinary when you consider that they adopted it at a time when people were still thinking it was hocus pocus. And here are two logical scientists who adopt it, which I think is amazing. And they've just gone from strength to strength. And the first wines were made by Stephen's father, Cyril Henschke. Right. And they became very well liked. They were originally released as Mount Edelstone Claret, and they won lots of medals at Sydney, at wine shows in Sydney and Melbourne and elsewhere. And it's just generally, over a long period of time, become known as one of our great wines of South Australia and of Australia generally. And it's often connected in with Hill of Grace. And the Hill of Grace vineyard, the oldest vines go back to the 1860s. And there's something really magnificent about the Hill of Grace story. And because it's got a church just in front of it,
yes,
more famous visually, it's more memorable because of the church. But in terms of quality, Mount Edelstone and Hill of Grace, there's almost nothing between in terms of quality. Some years, I think the Mount Edelstone's better than the Hill of Grace and vice versa. And wines are made in a traditional Australian way in open slate fermenters, concrete and fully wax lined, and vinifications with wax line header boards, and after vinification going into oak barrels for maturation. It's all pretty simple, but at the same time very detailed and precise. And the wines have this wonderful aromatic complexity to them. When I was bottling, recorking old bottles of Grange old bottles of Hill of Grace and Mount Edelstone way back in the 90s, we were looking at the wines and thinking about what was the common aromatic that went through the wines. And we came up with the word sage. So it's not like mint, it's a kind of sage aromatic that
the sage character is definitely there.
Yeah, that wafts through that lovely pure blackberry pastille like aromatic. And they really are this wine is basically an Australian first growth. It's
no question.
It's just the most beautiful wine. And the 18th vintage is an absolutely stunning wine. And probably one of the finest vintages from that series. But what I love about this wine is it stands for so much. The Mount Edelstone was originally called Mount Edelstein, and its name changed in 1916.
Stein, it's just German for stone. That's
right. So it was called Edelstein. And it's so steeped in the history of German settlers, the modernization of Australian winemaking, the generations of family effort, science. Prue Henschke and Stephen Henschke are a remarkable couple. And whenever I taste these wines, there's a specialness about them that they absolutely stand for what I love so much about Australian wine and the Australian industry.
Yeah, in my history, early in my career in the early '90s, it was the Henschke wines more than any others that turned my head about what Australian wines both were and what could grow to be even further. And the Henschkes have never faltered. Stephen and Prue, I agree with you. And they're also just some of the best vintners in terms of nurturing and caring
Yeah.
the vine, the wines, but also about the people that they work with. Their children have shown no less of a beautiful human range of behaviors in my experience since that time. And the wines have only, if you can imagine, they were great 30 years ago. They're even greater today.
Yeah, and I think the other thing you mentioned about Shiraz and Henschke and everything, the success of Australian wine is also related to the work done on Penfolds with the discovery of the relationship between pH and wine stability by Dr. Ray Beckwith in the 1930s, and the development of Penfolds Grange Hermitage, or now known as Penfolds Grange, during the 1950s. And all of that work set up the modern Australian wine industries. For instance, the Henschke family, Cyril Henschke, knew people like Wolf Blass and Max Schubert, and although a lot of the stuff at Penfolds was kept under strict wraps during the 1950s and 1960s. By the 1970s, a lot of that technical know-how had seeped through the industry, and a lot of wine producers in the Barossa, McLaren Vale, and elsewhere in the Hunter Valley, even in Margaret River, are beneficiaries of the experimental work done by Max Schubert and his team in the 1950s and early 1960s.
Going back in the years just a little bit further, again, sidetracking here a bit, to what extent, if any, did Australian men's involvement in the 20th century world wars help to shift the appreciation and or production of wine back home, in as much as the men who were supporting the Queen and country on the European continent and throughout Asia, but more so in Europe, I would think, their exposure to European wines, did it have any effect, do you reckon, or is that just purely...
Completely. The First World War and the Second World War were, of course, as they were for the United States of America as well, were defining moments for your country and for ours. The First World War was a disaster for Australia. Every single man who died in Europe, 60,000 men, were volunteers, and they didn't come back. There's a photograph from volume 2 of the Australian Ark, page 9, of a group of people. They're about 4 adults, 10 children, 10, I would call them children, mostly aged probably between 10 and 14, say. And it's a picture that's dated around 1908. And behind them is a wagon of grapes that have just been picked from a nearby vineyard near Aldana, which is now a defunct vineyard, but is in Adelaide, right next to Penfolds McGill. And there's a note next to that photograph that was made by a guy called Hurtle Walker, who was one of the boys amongst those 10 group. And he wrote that of those 10 boys, only 3 came back.
Tough numbers.
So we lost a lot of people. And my great-grandfather was killed at Gallipoli in 1915. So it was pretty tough.
I'm sure the loss was felt by father or mother for that. Yeah, your mother aside.
No. So there were a lot of families. There were a lot of families that were affected. But also the other thing is that we got a lot of immigrants that came back after a lot of displaced Eastern Europeans, a lot of soldiers coming back from the war, and they completely shaped the way that Australian wine developed.
Yeah, I can only imagine that would be the case, having been wanting some solace in the terrible conditions they endured in both of those wars, and to enjoy.
They'd watched how people lived in Europe, and of course, when they were going through all the villages in France and elsewhere, they saw that type of lifestyle, and during the First World War, the French army they drank a lot of wine. It was a lot of Spanish wine, actually, not French wine. And the Australians came up with words like plonk or plinkety plonk. They had all these names that
Still in use today.
yeah, that's right. But those were names that were developed by Australian soldiers during the First World War.
Trenches, yeah.
And then, so we had an influx of immigrants after the First World War. There were quite a lot of Italians that came in, and they were very much involved in winemaking. We had an influx of 3 lots of Italians. First lot were in the 1850s after the gold rush of 1851. So there's surviving 1860s planted vines in the middle of Victoria.
Wow.
But after the Second World War, the modernization of the Australian wine industry was very much linked to the return of soldiers and immigrants to Australia.
So last wine we have today is from going back west again, is the Vasse Felix Cabernet Sauvignon. You wanted this because there was a particular clone called the Houghton clone.
Yeah, it's called the horse. What we call it's really funny because that name in South Australia, there's a town just north of Adelaide called Houghton. It's exactly like that, but it's normally called Horton. It's Horton, the Horton clone. But that shows you how English spelling can be confusing because you've got one lot call it one way, one and another lot call it another. The reason why I put this in Cabernet is because it's got such a fascinating history.
Please.
A bit like the gin clone. So as mentioned a bit earlier, we were talking about the importation of Cabernet Sauvignon into Australia in 1837. So when I was doing my research and everything like this for the Australian Ark, the received wisdom was that the Horton clone derived from material that came from South Africa. And this was the wisdom of the Department of Agriculture in Western Australia. But through my research, I've proven otherwise. And that is that the material actually comes from the east coast of Australia. And it's almost certain that it relates to the original vine stock importation brought into Australia in 1838. But the Horton clone, like the gin clone, has played a very important part in the development of Margaret River and the lower Great Southern as well, Franklin River and the like. And it's a Cabernet Sauvignon that's based on a vineyard that was planted called the Frenchman's Block in the Swan Valley that was ripped out in the 1930s, but no one quite knows where the Frenchman's Block was, but it was mentioned. And just like the gin clone, cuttings were taken down into the lower Great Southern to start off with, and it's proved to be very successful, and then was planted widely in Margaret River, so Vasse Felix, Cullen, Mosswood, Lewin Estates, all of the top estates in Margaret River, including Cloudburst, which is become an ultra fine kind of cult wine, which goes into the United States. They're all based on that clone. Small berries, beautiful polished tannins, and that make absolutely beautiful wine. And I just think that, again, it's 19th century genetic vine stock material that came into Western Australia, probably somewhere in the 1860s or 1870s via New South Wales and then via South Australia. And there's enough evidence to if it's not true, it's a damn good story and a very compelling one because I've got newspaper articles to back my argument up.
This 2121 version, I got to say, I smell it and it says, "Oh, this is quite alive." However, it's got the smell of I think it's methoxypyrazines that often associate with Cabernet Sauvignon, and it smacks you there along with lots of the lovely fruit. I'm thinking, is this going to be ripe on the palate or a little bit green? Taste it. There is no greenness whatsoever. It is ripe, clean, vivacious, absolutely fun wine that showing it being Cabernet, it's showing its youth. It's structured to age nicely, I would think. Quite a poised wine, and at just under 50 US, certainly within the realm of some of the better Cabernets you'd find from the West Coast here, to be sure, and challenging to the better of the Bordeaux's, I would say, at that price.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a pretty reasonable price for a wine of that quality. The wines do age particularly well. They're lovely. I love Cabernet Sauvignon. I love it because you're talking about the methoxypyrazine aromatics or whatever it might, or that kind of thing. But what we're talking about is that these characters give an aromatic lift to the wine. So when you're smelling it, they just jump out of the glass, and they accentuate also those very ripe, dark berry, blackcurrant, pastille-like aromatics with the marzipan kind of elements of new oak. And then the tannins, the slightly grippiness of the tannins give the wine torque, Torque, as in grunt. And,
Sure.
and so they give the wine incredible length, and I just love them. I love Cabernet Sauvignon. There are a lot of people who just complete nutcases on Pinot Noir and all of those kind of things. And I do love Pinot Noir. I love everything, to be quite honest. But for me, Cabernet is great, especially at the end of the day.
You're a cab man. Okay. Look, as we wrap it up here, Andrew, you've done such work here with the Australian Ark, available through Academy Divan Library. And for those of you ordering in the US, be aware that it currently has no US distribution on the ground, so you have to order online. Go to academydivan.com, I believe it is. Having done this deep dive, long time overview into its past, is there anything you want to say about the great strides that have been made over these great many years and more in recent memory by Australia's wine producers? And what challenges might they be facing today, home and abroad, you can envision that might not be in place, or that you see in place that some points you might want to see addressed?
Yeah. So for people listening, the book is in 3 volumes.
Yes.
So volume 1 is 1788 to 1900, which explores the beginnings of winemaking in New South Wales and the development of a colonial wine industry across Australia and towards federation, which is when all the colonies combined to become the Commonwealth of Australia. And then from the volume 2 is 1901 to 1982, which covers the First World War and the Second World War period, and tells about all the technology and all the development. And then volume 3 from 1983 to 2023 really explores what's happened over the last 40 years. And actually volume 3 is the largest book, would you believe? But all up, it's 1,700 pages, and it's got an enormous amount of illustrations. It weighs a lot, 5.3 kilos. And if you look it up with the reviews, the World of Fine Wine's given a good review, and Jancis Robinson's given a good review, and the main kind of reviewers have done pretty well on it. But the thing I really feel about Australian wine is the ambitions for Australian wine was always a fine wine ambition. And it got slightly derailed. It got more than slightly derailed in the 1920s because there was post the First World War, there was this social engineering to provide a living for returning soldiers and immigrants and all of that kind of stuff. And the British government wanted to thank the Empire for its contribution to the First World War. And there was the introduction of the 1924 Export Bounty Act, which pivoted the Australian wine industry from being a table wine manufacturer to a fortified wine producer. Wow. And so as a consequence to that, Australia's reputation is kind of slightly linked into this period of fortified wine production rather than all the exquisite table wines that were being produced in the late 19th century. But I think that having been a part of it over the last 40 years, it's just the technological advances and the maturity of thinking of winemakers that no one's trying to emulate what was happening in Europe anymore. And so you see an exploration of Australian terroirs, for want of a better word, aided by technology and incredible winemaking philosophies. There's a group of winemakers that have a conference every year called Pinot Massive. And it's a whole group of very talented technical winemakers, but also very connected to the land. And they share their wines and they talk about what went well, what didn't go well. And they also invite other winemakers who have got less experience And they've literally single-handedly improved Australian Pinot Noir, and some of the great, which you can really call them truly great Pinot Noirs being produced. So we're seeing all these technical advances. In the meantime, we've got things like climate change happening. And climate change is a double-edged thing. It's something that we're all anxious about. But what it's also doing is it's sharpening our imagination, and it's causing enormous amount of innovation in the vineyard and ways, and this kind of commitment to sustainable winemaking and AI, for instance, autonomous vehicles, new ways of growing grapes using special applications to prevent sunburn, canopy management, where I would literally with canopies over vineyards. There are just so many things. And then in the vineyard, in the winery itself, just the techniques, the empathy. Australia's making probably the greatest wines in its entire history right now.
No doubt.
And this is something that we need to push forward. But one of the things that we will also hear about Australian wines is that we're in the grip of a crisis. And the crisis is related to the fact that the Australian wine industry is a two-speed type of thing. We have commercial wines, a lot of them based on the inland irrigated areas of Australia, and the cost of production there has gone up, and the water availability is going down. And then, of course, with those China tariffs, which have been taken off now, have impacted heavily on production. So there are a lot of families doing it really tough. And so there's a lot of soul searching. And unfortunately, Australians have a habit of coming out with all their grievances out in public. And so you think, oh my God, what's going on? But that's the way we sort things out. And then you sort things out quickly when things go out in the open. And then we carry on and we improve and we get better at what we do. So we're going through a process of real soul searching. And I think what's going to happen with Australian wine is we're going to land up becoming more premiumized in what we produce. That is producing less, producing very high quality wine based on our best sites where one can farm sustainably and naturally. And so I think for American listeners, it would be great if you supported us in our vision to make beautiful wines.
Andrew Caillard, Master of Wine, author of The Australian Ark, The Story of Australian Wine. It's my opinion that your just published work has added to the annals of great Australian wine. As time goes on, this will be noted. And I thank you for your time, your attention, and your great eloquence here at Drinking on the Edge.
Thank you, David, for inviting me on your show. I really appreciate it, and your enthusiasm and interest in wine from a worldwide perspective. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you so much.